Some people think family bonds are unbreakable, that blood runs thicker than water, and relatives will always have your back when things get tough. I used to believe that too, until the day my own brother looked me in the eyes, smiled, and deliberately pushed my 2-year-old daughter down a flight of concrete steps. What happened next would change everything I thought I knew about justice, family, and what it means to protect the people you love most. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Mia Davis, and this story begins on what should have been a perfect Saturday afternoon in Newport Beach, California. The sun was streaming through the kitchen windows of our modest 2-bedroom apartment, and I was watching my daughter Emma toddle around the living room, her tiny hands gripping her favorite stuffed elephant as she practiced her unsteady steps. Emma had just turned 2 the month before, and every day brought new discoveries. She'd recently learned to say mama with perfect clarity, though dada still came out as da-da-da-da in an endless, adorable loop that made my husband Marcus laugh every single time. Marcus was deployed with the Coast Guard, stationed on a cutter somewhere in the Pacific, conducting maritime security operations that he couldn't discuss in detail during our brief video calls. The loneliness of military life was something I'd grown accustomed to over the past 5 years of marriage. Marcus had worked his way up from petty officer to lieutenant commander, and now, at 34, he was being considered for promotion to commander. His dedication to service was one of the things I'd fallen in love with, but it also meant long stretches of single parenting while he was away protecting our nation's waters. That particular Saturday, I was expecting my brother Jake for his first visit since Emma's birthday. Jake was 3 years older than me, and we'd grown up in a complicated household in Sacramento. Our father had left when I was 8, and our mother worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Jake had always been the rebellious one, getting into fights at school, staying out past curfew, and generally making Mom's life more difficult than it needed to be. As adults, our relationship was strained but civil. Jake had never quite found his footing. He'd bounced between jobs, relationships, and cities, always searching for something that seemed perpetually out of reach. He'd been living in San Diego for the past year, working construction when he could find it, and he'd called me the week before asking if he could visit. "I want to meet my niece properly," he'd said over the phone, his voice carrying that familiar mix of charm and uncertainty that had defined him since childhood. "And I want to make things right between us, Mia. I know I haven't been the best brother." Against Marcus's gentle concerns, expressed during our last video call before his communication blackout, I'd agreed to the visit. Family was important to me, and despite everything, Jake was the only blood relative I had left after Mom's passing 2 years earlier. Jake arrived at exactly noon, carrying a large wrapped box and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He looked older than his 31 years, with premature lines around his eyes and a weariness that seemed to settle in his shoulders. His construction work had kept him lean but strong, and he moved with the restless energy of someone who never quite felt comfortable staying in one place too long. "There's my beautiful sister," he said, wrapping me in a hug that lasted a beat too long, "and this must be the famous Emma." Emma, true to her cautious nature with strangers, hid behind my legs, peeking out at Jake with wide, curious eyes. She clutched her elephant tighter and made a small sound that wasn't quite a word, but clearly expressed her uncertainty about this new person in her safe space. "She's shy at first," I explained, gently stroking Emma's silky blonde hair. "Give her a few minutes to warm up." Jake knelt down to Emma's eye level, his expression softening in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Hey there, little princess. I'm your Uncle Jake. I brought you something special." He held out the wrapped box, and Emma's natural curiosity began to overcome her shyness. She took a tentative step forward, then another, until she was close enough to touch the bright red wrapping paper. "Can she open it now?" Jake asked, looking up at me with what seemed like genuine excitement. "Of course," I said, settling onto the floor beside them. "Emma, Uncle Jake brought you a present." Inside the box was a beautiful wooden toy train set, complete with tracks, bridges, and tiny wooden people. Emma's eyes lit up with wonder, and she immediately began pulling pieces from the box, her small hands exploring each component with the intense focus that only toddlers possess. "Jake, this is incredible," I said, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. You didn't have to spend so much. She's my niece, he replied, but something flickered across his face, a shadow that was there and gone so quickly I almost missed it. Besides, I wanted to make a good impression. The afternoon unfolded pleasantly enough. We assembled the train set together on the living room floor, with Emma directing our efforts through a combination of pointing, babbling, and the occasional clear word. Jake seemed genuinely delighted by her personality, laughing at her attempts to stack the wooden blocks in impossible configurations and patiently showing her how the train cars connected. We ordered pizza for lunch, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in weeks. It felt good to have adult conversation, even if Jake seemed distracted at times, checking his phone frequently and glancing around the apartment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "So, how are things with the Coast Guard husband?" Jake asked, as Emma played with her trains, making elaborate crashing sounds as she sent the wooden cars careening off the coffee table. "His name is Marcus," I said, a slight edge creeping into my voice. Jake had never made an effort to remember Marcus's name, always referring to him as the military guy or your husband in a tone that suggested mild disapproval. "And things are good, challenging with the deployments, but good." "Must be nice," Jake said, and there was definitely something bitter in his tone now. Having someone who can just sail away whenever things get complicated at home? I felt my defenses rise. "It's not like that, Jake. Marcus is serving our country. He doesn't get to choose when he deploys or for how long." "Right," Jake said, but his smile had turned cold. "Meanwhile, you're here playing house with his kid, living in his apartment, probably spending his money." The shift in his demeanor was so sudden and sharp that it left me speechless for a moment. Alma, sensitive to the change in atmosphere, looked up from her trains with a concerned expression. "Jake, what's wrong with you?" I asked, keeping my voice low for Emma's sake. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the parking lot below. When he turned back, his expression was a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like desperation. "You want to know what's wrong with me, Mia? I'm broke. Completely, utterly broke. I got fired from my last job 3 weeks ago, and I've been sleeping in my car. I came here thinking maybe my successful little sister and her military husband might be willing to help the family out." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The confession hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Emma had stopped playing and was watching us with the uncanny awareness that small children have for adult tension. "Jake," I said carefully, "why didn't you just ask? If you needed help, we could have talked about it." "Could we?" he asked, his voice rising despite Emma's presence. "Could we really? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've got everything figured out. Nice apartment, cute kid, husband with a steady government paycheck. Meanwhile, I'm barely surviving." I could feel the situation spiraling, but I wasn't sure how to pull it back. This wasn't the brother I remembered from childhood. Difficult, yes, but not cruel. There was something desperate and dangerous in his eyes now that made my maternal instincts scream warnings. "We can figure something out," I said, standing slowly and moving closer to Emma. "But you need to calm down. You're scaring Emma." As if my words had flipped a switch, Jake's expression twisted into something I'd never seen before. He looked at Emma, then at me, and I saw calculation in his eyes that made my blood run cold. "You know what, sister? Maybe it's time little Emma learned that the world isn't all toy trains and pretty apartments." Before I could react, before I could even process what he meant, Jake moved toward the stairs leading to our second-floor apartment. Emma, curious about where Uncle Jake was going, toddled after him with her elephant clutched in one hand. "Emma, no," I called, but she was already at the top of the concrete steps that led down to the parking lot. Jake turned around, looked directly at me, and smiled. Then he reached out and with deliberate force pushed my 2-year-old daughter down the flight of stairs. Time seemed to stop. I watched Emma tumble, her small body hitting each concrete step with sickening thuds, her elephant flying from her grasp, her confused cries turning to screams of pain and terror. The sound of her hitting the bottom step will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was moving before I realized it, screaming Emma's name, pushing past Jake, who stood frozen at the top of the stairs with that terrible smile still on his face. Emma lay crumpled at the bottom, blood seeping from a cut on her forehead, her left arm bent at an unnatural angle, her sobs echoing off the concrete walls. "Call 911, I screamed at Jake as I gathered Emma into my arms, trying to assess her injuries while comforting her terrified cries. "Call 911 right now." But when I looked up, Jake was gone. The sound of his car engine starting echoed through the parking garage, and by the time the ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, my brother had vanished completely. Emma's injuries were serious, but not life-threatening. A broken arm, a concussion, and multiple bruises and scrapes. As I sat beside her hospital bed that night, watching her sleep fitfully with her arm in a tiny cast, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to the police, to file charges against Jake for assault and child endangerment. The second was to Marcus's commanding officer, requesting emergency leave for a family crisis. What I didn't know was that Marcus had been promoted to Rear Admiral lower half just days before, making him one of the youngest flag officers in Coast Guard history. And what I couldn't have predicted was exactly how a Coast Guard Admiral responds when someone deliberately harms his family. Marcus arrived at San Diego International Airport 48 hours later, and I barely recognized the man who walked through those terminal doors. Gone was the warm, easy smile that had charmed me through 7 years of marriage. In its place was something I'd never seen before, a cold, calculating intensity that seemed to radiate from every line of his body. He'd flown in from Pearl Harbor on a military transport, using emergency leave protocols that I didn't even know existed. When he embraced me in the hospital corridor, I felt the coiled tension in his muscles, like he was holding back a force that could level buildings. "How is she?" were his first words, spoken quietly but with an undertone that made nearby nurses glance at our direction. "Sleeping," I whispered, leading him to Emma's room. "The doctors say she'll recover completely, but Marcus, the things Jake said before he—" "Later," he said, his voice carrying an authority I'd never heard him use with me. "Show me the security footage first." I hadn't even thought about security cameras, but Marcus had already obtained copies from the apartment complex management during the 2 hours he'd been in San Diego before coming to the hospital. His Coast Guard credentials had opened doors that civilian requests might have taken weeks to access. We sat in the hospital's family conference room while Marcus pulled up the footage on his laptop. Watching it was almost worse than living through it. The cold, premeditated way Jake surveyed the stairs, the calculated timing of his push, the complete absence of remorse as he walked away while Emma lay bleeding. Marcus watched it 3 times without speaking. On the 4th viewing, he paused the video just as Jake's face turned toward the camera, that terrible smile clearly visible. "Jacob Morrison," Marcus said quietly, reading from a file he'd apparently already compiled. "Age 31, last known address in San Diego, currently wanted for assault in the 2nd degree and child endangerment in the 1st degree. Previous arrests for bar fights, petty theft, and domestic disturbance calls." "How did you get all this so quickly?" I asked. "I made some calls from Hawaii," he said, closing the laptop with deliberate precision. "Mia, there's something you need to understand about what happened when you called my CO. The promotion came through 3 days ago. I'm not just Lieutenant Commander Davis anymore." He pulled out his new identification card, and I stared at the single-star insignia that marked him as Rear Admiral lower half Marcus Davis, the youngest flag officer in the Coast Guard's recent history, with responsibilities I was only beginning to grasp. "The promotion gives me certain resources," he continued, his tone clinical but with an underlying current that made me shiver. "Resources that I intend to use." Over the next week, while Emma recovered and began to smile again, Marcus orchestrated what he called a comprehensive response to the threat against our family. He worked primarily from our apartment, making calls and receiving visits from people whose names he didn't share and whose business cards I never saw. The first sign that something was happening came when Jake's car was found abandoned in Tijuana, Mexico, just south of the border. Mexican authorities had impounded it after finding it parked illegally for 5 days, but there was no sign of Jake himself. Interesting choice, Marcus commented when the police called with the update. Mexico doesn't have an extradition treaty for assault charges below a certain severity level. But Marcus seemed oddly unconcerned about Jake's escape to Mexico. If anything, he appeared satisfied, as though Jake had moved exactly where Marcus had expected him to go. The second development came a week later. Jake's cell phone, which had been disconnected since the day he pushed Emma, suddenly started receiving calls from unknown numbers. Not calls he answered, according to the phone company records that Marcus had somehow obtained, but calls that pinged his location to cell towers throughout Baja California. "He's running," Marcus explained over dinner while Emma played with her trains, her cast now decorated with stickers from every nurse on the pediatric ward. "But he's running scared, which means he's making mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Marcus set down his fork and looked at me with an expression that was both tender and terrifying. "Mia, when someone attacks a Coast Guard family, it becomes a matter of national security protocol. There are procedures, resources, and authorities that most civilians never know exist." He pulled out a thick folder marked with official Coast Guard seals. Inside were documents I couldn't fully understand: authorizations, resource allocations, and what appeared to be surveillance reports. "Jake Morrison is no longer just a man who hurt his niece and ran away," Marcus said quietly. "He's a fugitive who fled to a foreign country after committing a violent crime against a military family. That changes everything." The scope of what Marcus had set in motion became clear over the following days. Jake wasn't just being pursued by local police or even the FBI. Marcus had somehow elevated this to a joint task force involving Coast Guard intelligence, Border Patrol, and what he referred to as specialized assets in Mexico. "You have to understand," Marcus explained during one of our late-night conversations, "the Coast Guard doesn't just patrol waters. We have authority for border security, drug interdiction, and maritime law enforcement throughout the Americas. Jake crossed into our operational theater." But it wasn't just official channels. Marcus had also activated what he called informal networks, contacts from his years of service who now held positions throughout law enforcement and military intelligence. People who owed him favors, respected his service, or simply understood that harming a Coast Guard Admiral's family was not something that would go unanswered. "Marcus," I said one evening after putting Emma to bed, "what exactly are you planning to do when you find Jake?" He was silent for a long moment, staring out at the ocean that had defined his career and shaped his sense of justice. "I'm going to make sure he never hurts our family again," he said finally, "and I'm going to make sure he understands exactly what he brought down on himself when he decided to push our daughter down those stairs." The intensity in his voice made it clear that this went beyond simple legal prosecution. Marcus was thinking like a military strategist, planning an operation with multiple contingencies and decisive objectives. 3 weeks after Emma's release from the hospital, Marcus received a call that changed his entire demeanor. He listened without speaking for nearly 10 minutes, making occasional notes on a pad that he didn't let me see. When he hung up, he was smiling for the first time since arriving home. "Jake made contact with a known smuggling network in Ensenada," he said. "Apparently, he's trying to arrange passage further south, maybe to Guatemala or Costa Rica, countries without extradition treaties." "But that's good news, right?" I asked. "It means you know where he is." Marcus's smile widened, and I realized it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Oh, it's better than that, sweetheart. You see, that particular smuggling network has been under Coast Guard surveillance for 8 months as part of Operation Blue Thunder. We've been tracking their radio frequencies, their boat schedules, and their financial transactions." He stood up and began pacing, his strategic mind clearly engaged in ways I'd rarely seen outside of his professional life. "Jake Morrison thinks he's buying his way to freedom. What he's actually doing is stepping directly into a controlled operation that I've been authorized to conclude at my discretion." The implications of his words began to sink in, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. Marcus, what does that mean exactly? He stopped pacing and looked at me with the expression I'd seen in our wedding photos, loving, protective, and completely devoted to our family's safety. It means, my dear wife, that your brother is about to discover what happens when you threaten a Coast Guard Admiral's family. And I promise you, Mia, he will never be in a position to hurt Emma or you or anyone else ever again. The next morning, Marcus left for what he described as a brief operational deployment to conclude family business. He kissed Emma goodbye, held me close, and promised to be back within a week. What I didn't know was that he was heading south with resources and authority that would make Jake's worst nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. The call came at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, jarring me from restless sleep. Emma had been having nightmares about falling, and I'd spent most of the night sitting beside her bed, stroking her hair until she settled back into peaceful dreams. Mrs. Davis? The voice was crisp, professional, with the unmistakable cadence of military communications. This is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen from Coast Guard Intelligence. Your husband asked me to contact you. My heart hammered against my ribs. Is Marcus okay? Admiral Davis is fine, ma'am. He wanted you to know that Operation Seahawk has reached its conclusion phase. He'll be home tomorrow evening. Operation Seahawk. Even the name sounded ominous, and I realized that whatever Marcus had planned for Jake was far more elaborate than I'd imagined. The next evening, Marcus walked through our front door carrying a single manila envelope and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. He looked tired but satisfied, like someone who'd completed a difficult but necessary task. Emma ran to him with squeals of delight, her cast-covered arm not slowing her down at all. He scooped her up carefully, spinning her around while she giggled, and for a moment he was just her daddy again, not the calculating military strategist who'd spent the week hunting his brother-in-law. "How's my brave girl?" he asked, examining the new stickers that had appeared on her cast. "I drew you a picture, Daddy," Emma announced, wriggling down to retrieve a crayon drawing from the coffee table. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, clearly meant to be our family, standing next to what looked like a boat. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Marcus said, but his eyes met mine over Emma's head with an expression that promised answers once she was asleep. After Emma's bedtime routine, we sat on our balcony overlooking the harbor. The lights of Coast Guard vessels twinkled in the distance, and I could hear the familiar sounds of maritime operations that had provided the soundtrack to our marriage. "Tell me," I said simply. Marcus opened the manila envelope and spread its contents on the small table between us. Photographs, documents, and what appeared to be official reports created a mosaic of information that told a story I wasn't prepared to hear. "Jake made it to Ensenada exactly as we predicted," Marcus began, his tone clinical but not cold. He contacted the smuggling network through intermediaries, offering cash for passage to Costa Rica. What he didn't know was that every move he made was being monitored by Joint Task Force assets. He pointed to a series of surveillance photographs showing Jake in various locations around the Mexican port city, buying supplies, meeting with suspicious characters, and clearly trying to blend in with the transient population of people seeking to disappear. The network agreed to transport him, but they demanded payment up front, $20,000. Jake didn't have that kind of money, so he did exactly what we expected him to do. Marcus slid another photograph across the table. This one showed Jake entering what appeared to be a bank or money transfer office. He called our mother's life insurance beneficiary and convinced them to advance him money against his share of the estate, told them it was a family emergency involving medical bills for Emma. The audacity of using Emma's injuries he'd caused, to fund his escape made my stomach turn. But Marcus wasn't finished. The transfer was flagged by Treasury Department protocols for suspicious international transactions. That gave us legal authority to freeze the funds and track their destination. He showed me banking documents with official seals and signatures I couldn't decipher. When Jake went to collect his money, he walked into a coordinated operation involving Mexican federal police, U.S. Border Patrol, and Coast Guard intelligence. "You had him arrested?" I asked. Marcus's expression grew more complex. "Not exactly. You see, Mia, Jake Morrison had become more than just a family problem. His flight to Mexico, his contact with known criminal networks, and his use of fraudulent financial instruments had made him a person of interest in multiple ongoing investigations." He pulled out a thick folder marked with classification stamps. "The smuggling network he contacted has been moving drugs and weapons north for over 2 years. By associating with them, Jake became what we call a target of opportunity for a much larger operation." The scope of what Marcus had orchestrated began to dawn on me. This wasn't just about bringing Jake to justice for pushing Emma. This was about neutralizing a threat using the full resources of the United States military and intelligence apparatus. "The operation concluded at 400 hours yesterday morning," Marcus continued. "Mexican federal police, supported by Coast Guard assets, raided the compound where Jake was staying. They arrested 17 individuals, including the entire leadership structure of the smuggling network." "And Jake?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the harbor where his career had taught him that some problems required decisive action. "Jake Morrison died during the raid," he said finally. "According to official reports, he was killed when he attempted to flee custody and fell from a second-story balcony onto concrete pavement below." The words hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything Jake had done, despite the calculated cruelty he'd shown toward Emma, he was still my brother. The boy who'd shared a bedroom with me, who'd taught me to ride a bike, who'd held me when I cried after our father left. "Marcus," I whispered, "what really happened?" He reached across the table and took my hands in his. His touch was warm, familiar, but his eyes held depths I'd never seen before. "What really happened, sweetheart, is that a man who deliberately injured our daughter discovered that there are consequences for threatening military families. The official report stands as written. Jake Morrison died attempting to escape custody during a legitimate law enforcement operation." But there was something in his tone, something in the precise way he emphasized certain words that suggested the official report might not tell the complete story. "The Mexican authorities have closed their investigation," he continued. "The smuggling network has been dismantled. The threat to our family has been permanently neutralized. And Jake Morrison will never hurt another child again." I stared at the photographs spread across the table, images of my brother's last days, captured by surveillance equipment I hadn't known existed. In the final photo, taken outside the compound where he died, Jake looked haggard and desperate, nothing like the man who smiled while pushing Emma down those stairs. "Did he know?" I asked. "In the end, did he know that you were behind it?" Marcus gathered the documents carefully, returning them to their envelope with methodical precision. "Intelligence reports suggest that Jake Morrison became increasingly paranoid during his final weeks in Mexico. He apparently told several people that he believed he was being hunted by his sister's military husband. Whether he understood the full scope of the operation against him is unclear." He sealed the envelope and set it aside, then turned to face me fully. "Mia, I need you to understand something. What happened to Jake wasn't revenge. It wasn't personal vendetta. It was a military operation designed to neutralize a threat to Coast Guard personnel and their families. Everything I did was within my authority and jurisdiction as a flag officer." "But it was also for Emma," I said quietly. For the first time since coming home, Marcus's professional composure cracked slightly. "Yes," he said simply, "it was also for Emma, and for you, and for every other military family who needs to know that there are people willing to go to any length to protect them." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the harbor sounds and processing the magnitude of what had transpired. My brother was dead, killed during an operation orchestrated by my husband. The man I'd married, the father of my child, had used his military position and resources to ensure that Jake would never threaten our family again. "What happens now?" I asked eventually. Marcus stood up and moved to the railing, looking out at the Coast Guard vessels that represented his world, his authority, and his responsibility. "Now we move forward," he said. "Emma heals completely. You process this however you need to, and we remember that some people who threaten military families discover that those families are protected by the full might and authority of the United States Armed Forces." He turned back to me with the expression I'd fallen in love with 7 years earlier: protective, devoted, and absolutely certain in his convictions. Jake Morrison made his choice when he pushed our daughter down those stairs. Every consequence that followed was a direct result of that choice. I simply ensured that the consequences were thorough and permanent. Inside the apartment, Emma called out from her bedroom, probably having another nightmare about falling. Marcus was moving before I could react, heading to comfort his daughter with the same decisive authority he'd used to eliminate the threat against her. As I followed him inside, I realized that I was married to a man who would literally move heaven and earth to protect our family. The question wasn't whether I could live with what he'd done. The question was whether I could live in a world where such protection was necessary. 3 months later, I was standing in the kitchen making Emma's favorite pancakes when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw 2 people I didn't recognize: a woman in a dark suit carrying a briefcase, and a man who had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. Emma was in her high chair, chattering away in her mixture of real words and toddler babble, her cast finally removed and her arm fully healed. She'd stopped having nightmares about falling, but she still instinctively moved away from stairs and always insisted on holding someone's hand when we encountered them. "Mrs. Davis," the woman said when I opened the door, "I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. This is Detective Raymond Walsh from San Diego PD. We'd like to speak with you about your brother's death in Mexico." My blood turned to ice. Marcus had assured me that all investigations were closed, that Jake's death had been ruled accidental during a legitimate law enforcement operation. But the serious expressions on these officials' faces suggested otherwise. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I thought that the matter was resolved." "May we come in?" Agent Torres asked. It wasn't really a question. I led them to the living room while Emma continued her breakfast conversation with her stuffed elephant. The agent sat across from me, and Detective Walsh pulled out a digital recorder. "Mrs. Davis, we're conducting what's called a collateral investigation," Agent Torres explained. "When a U.S. military officer's family member dies under unusual circumstances in a foreign country, particularly when that officer has used military resources in connection with the case, we're required to examine all aspects of the situation." "What kind of aspects?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Detective Walsh leaned forward. "We've been reviewing communications records, financial transactions, and resource allocations related to Operation Seahawk. Some elements of the timeline don't align with standard protocols." They knew. Somehow, despite Marcus's careful planning and official authorizations, someone had identified irregularities in how the operation had been conducted. "We understand this is difficult," Agent Torres continued, "but we need to ask you some specific questions about your husband's activities following your daughter's injury." For the next hour, they walked me through a detailed timeline of events. They knew about Marcus's emergency leave, his rapid collection of intelligence on Jake, and his coordination with multiple agencies. What concerned them, they explained, was the speed and scope of resources that had been deployed for what was initially a simple assault case. "Mrs. Davis," Detective Walsh said, consulting his notes, "did your husband ever discuss using unofficial channels or personal contacts to track your brother?" I thought about Marcus's late-night phone calls, his meetings with people whose names he'd never shared, and his confidence that Jake would be found. The official story was one thing, but these investigators seemed to know there had been more to it. "I trusted my husband to handle the situation appropriately," I said carefully. "He's a career military officer with an impeccable service record." Agent Torres nodded. "Admiral Davis does indeed have an exemplary record. That's partly why this investigation is necessary. When someone of his rank and reputation becomes personally involved in an operation, we need to ensure that personal motivations don't compromise professional judgment." They asked about Jake's history, his financial situation, and whether I knew about his criminal associations in Mexico. They were particularly interested in how Marcus had predicted Jake's movements so accurately. "Mrs. Davis," Agent Torres said near the end of the interview, "we want you to know that this investigation isn't targeting you or your daughter, but we need to understand whether military resources were used inappropriately to settle a personal matter." After they left, I called Marcus immediately. He was in a meeting at Coast Guard headquarters in Long Beach, but he returned my call within minutes. "They know something," I told him, recounting the agent's questions and their apparent knowledge of operational details. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I've been expecting this," he said finally. "Inspector General investigations are standard when flag officers are involved in incidents with civilian casualties. Don't worry, Mia. Everything I did was within my authority." But that evening, when Marcus came home, I could see the strain in his face. For the first time since Jake's death, he looked uncertain about the consequences of his actions. "How much trouble are you in?" I asked after Emma was asleep. Marcus sat heavily in his chair, loosening his tie with movements that lacked his usual precision. "The investigation is focusing on something called mission creep," he explained. "They're questioning whether Operation Seahawk expanded beyond its original law enforcement mandate into something more personal." "Did it?" I asked. He looked at me with an expression that was both tired and resolved. "Honestly, yes. What started as tracking a fugitive became something much more comprehensive once I understood the threat Jake represented to our family." Over the following weeks, the investigation intensified. Marcus was called to testify before a closed-door panel at the Pentagon. His access to certain classified materials was temporarily suspended. Most concerning, rumors began circulating within Coast Guard leadership about a possible court-martial proceeding. "The problem," Marcus explained during one of our increasingly tense dinners, "is that they've identified what they call disproportionate resource allocation. Basically, they think I used too much firepower to deal with one criminal." "But Jake was working with smugglers," I protested. "That made it a legitimate operation." "That's my argument," Marcus agreed. "But they're saying I orchestrated Jake's contact with the smugglers specifically to create justification for military intervention." The accusation was damning because, I suspected, it was probably true. Marcus had predicted Jake's movements too accurately, had resources positioned too perfectly for it all to have been coincidental. The breaking point came when Agent Torres returned, this time with a warrant to search our apartment. They were looking for communications records, financial documents, and any evidence of unauthorized intelligence gathering. Emma clung to my leg as strangers went through our home, confused by the serious faces and official atmosphere. I tried to explain that these were helpers, like police officers, but she could sense the tension and anxiety that permeated every room. They found Marcus's personal files related to Jake's case, copies of surveillance photos, contact information for Mexican law enforcement, and detailed timelines that showed planning far in advance of official authorization. "Mrs. Davis," Agent Torres said as they prepared to leave, "we'll need you to testify before the investigative panel next week. You'll be under oath, and I want you to understand that lying to federal investigators is a serious crime." That night, Marcus and I had the most difficult conversation of our marriage. "They're going to ask me if you planned this from the beginning," I said, "if you used your position to orchestrate Jake's death rather than his arrest." Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out at the harbor that had defined his career. "What are you going to tell them?" he asked finally. "I don't know," I admitted. "What's the truth, Marcus? Did you plan for Jake to die?" He turned to face me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not regret, exactly, but a kind of weary acceptance of consequences. "I planned to neutralize the threat to our family," he said carefully. "Jake's death wasn't the primary objective, but it was an acceptable outcome if other methods proved insufficient." The clinical language couldn't hide what he was really saying. Marcus had been willing to kill my brother, if necessary, to protect Emma and me. "The investigators think they can prove premeditation," Marcus continued. "They have evidence that I positioned assets before Jake even made contact with the smugglers. They can show that I used my authority to create a situation where lethal force was likely. What does that mean for you? I asked. Court-martial, he said simply. Potential criminal charges. Definitely the end of my military career. I thought about Emma, about the man who'd read her bedtime stories and taught her to say Admiral, about the father who'd eliminated a threat to his daughter with the systematic thoroughness of a military operation. Marcus, I said finally, when I testify next week, what do you want me to say? He reached across the table and took my hands, his grip steady despite everything crumbling around us. Tell them the truth, Mia. Tell them that Admiral Marcus Davis used every resource at his disposal to protect his family from a clear and present danger. Tell them that Jake Morrison made his choice when he pushed Emma down those stairs, and that every consequence that followed was a direct result of that choice. He paused, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. And tell them that if I had to do it again, knowing everything I know now about the cost, I would make exactly the same decisions. The next morning, Marcus left for what would be his final day as a Coast Guard officer. By evening, formal charges had been filed, and his resignation had been quietly accepted to avoid the scandal of a court-martial. As I prepared for my own testimony, I realized that our family had survived Jake's attack, but we might not survive the consequences of Marcus's response. The man who'd moved heaven and earth to protect us had sacrificed his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom in the process. The question now was whether a military justice system would see his actions as those of a devoted father and husband, or as the abuse of power by an officer who'd let personal vengeance override professional duty. The federal building in downtown San Diego felt like a fortress when I arrived for my testimony. Security checkpoints, metal detectors, and stern-faced marshals created an atmosphere that made clear this wasn't just another government proceeding. This was about whether a Coast Guard Admiral had committed crimes in the name of protecting his family. Emma was staying with Marcus's sister in Phoenix, blissfully unaware that her father's freedom hung in the balance of what I would say under oath. I'd kissed her goodbye that morning, promising to bring Daddy home soon, though I wasn't sure it was a promise I could keep. The hearing room was smaller than I expected, dominated by a long table where 5 military officers in dress uniforms sat like judges at a tribunal. At the center was Admiral Catherine Harrison, a woman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for officers who brought dishonor to the service. Marcus sat with his military defense counsel, Lieutenant Colonel David Kim, at a table facing the panel. He wore his dress blue uniform, all ribbons and insignia still in place, though everyone in the room knew this might be the last time he'd have the right to wear them. Mrs. Davis, Admiral Harrison said as I was sworn in, you understand that you're testifying under oath in a proceeding that could result in criminal charges against your husband? Yes, ma'am, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. The prosecution began with questions about the timeline following Emma's injury. They walked me through Marcus's emergency leave, his rapid intelligence gathering, and his coordination of what became Operation Seahawk. Mrs. Davis, did your husband ever express intent to harm a brother prior to the operation in Mexico? The question hung in the air like a sword. I thought about Marcus's words that first night home, his promise that Jake would never threaten our family again, spoken with the cold certainty of someone who'd already decided on a course of action. Admiral Davis expressed his intention to ensure that my brother could never hurt our daughter again, I answered carefully. Did he specify what methods he intended to use? I remembered the classified documents, the surveillance photos, the systematic way Marcus had tracked Jake's every movement. He said he would use all resources at his disposal to neutralize the threat to our family. The prosecution pressed harder. Mrs. Davis, did your husband tell you that he had positioned Coast Guard assets in Mexico before your brother even contacted the smuggling network? This was the crucial question, the one that could prove premeditation. I looked at Marcus, seeing the man who'd comforted Emma through nightmares, who'd sacrificed his career to protect us, who'd crossed legal and moral lines because someone had hurt his child.
Admiral Davis told me that he had resources available to track criminals who threatened military families, I said. He didn't provide operational details. It was technically true, though it skirted the edges of the fuller truth about Marcus's planning.
The defense took a different approach when their turn came. Lieutenant Colonel Kim focused on Jake's actions, Emma's injuries, and the legitimate law enforcement aspects of the operation. Mrs. Davis, please describe your brother's behavior on the day he assaulted your daughter. I recounted Jake's desperation, his bitterness about my life, and the calculated cruelty of his attack on Emma. The panel listened in silence as I described watching my 2-year-old daughter tumble down concrete stairs, pushed by her own uncle. In your opinion, Mrs. Davis, did your brother pose an ongoing threat to your family? Yes, I said without hesitation. Jake had shown that he was willing to hurt a defenseless child out of jealousy and spite. He'd fled the country to avoid accountability. I believed he would come back eventually to finish what he'd started. It was then that Lieutenant Colonel Kim asked the question I'd been dreading. Mrs. Davis, if you had known the full scope of what your husband planned to do, would you have tried to stop him? The room fell silent. This was the moment that would define not just Marcus's fate, but how I understood my own role in what had happened. I thought about Emma, about the nightmares that had finally stopped, about the security of knowing that Jake would never appear at our door again. No, I said quietly, I would not have tried to stop him. Admiral Harrison leaned forward. Can you explain that answer, Mrs. Davis? My husband took an oath to protect and defend, I said, my voice growing stronger. He spent his entire career serving his country, following orders, and putting duty before personal interests. But when someone deliberately harmed his child, he did what any father would do. He protected his family. I looked directly at the panel, meeting each officer's eyes in turn. Jake Morrison didn't accidentally hurt Emma. He didn't push her in a moment of anger or confusion. He looked at a 2-year-old child, calculated how to cause her maximum harm, and then smiled while he did it. That wasn't a family dispute or a momentary lapse in judgment. That was evil. The room was completely silent now, even the court reporter's fingers still on her keyboard. Admiral Davis used his training, his resources, and his authority to eliminate a threat that the civilian justice system couldn't handle. Jake had fled to Mexico specifically because he knew he could avoid prosecution there. Traditional law enforcement had no way to reach him, no way to prevent him from disappearing completely and potentially returning years later to finish what he'd started. I thought about Emma's laughter, about her innocent trust that Daddy would always keep her safe, about the man who'd made that trust meaningful through decisive action. My husband didn't abuse his power, I continued. He fulfilled the most fundamental duty of any father, protecting his child from someone who'd already proven willing to hurt her. The prosecution tried to redirect. Mrs. Davis, do you believe military officers should use their positions to settle personal grievances? I believe, I said carefully, that when the civilian justice system fails to protect military families, those families have the right to expect their service members to use whatever lawful means are available to ensure their safety. It was a careful distinction, one that acknowledged the complexity of Marcus's situation while defending his core motivations. Admiral Harrison called a recess, and I found myself in the hallway with Marcus and his attorney. For the first time in weeks, Marcus looked hopeful. "You did well there," Lieutenant Colonel Kim said. "Your testimony established clear provocation and ongoing threat, which supports our necessity defense." But Marcus was focused on something else entirely. "Mia, what you said about not trying to stop me, did you mean that?" I looked at my husband, this man who'd risked everything to protect our family, and realized that somewhere in the process of watching him orchestrate Jake's downfall, I'd stopped being horrified by his methods and started being grateful for his results. "Marcus, I've spent months trying to reconcile the man I married with what you did in Mexico, but watching Emma laugh and play without fear, knowing she's safe from someone who wanted to hurt her, yes, I meant every word." When the hearing resumed, Admiral Harrison addressed me directly. Mrs. Davis, the panel has deliberated on your testimony. While we cannot ignore the serious questions about your husband's methods, your account has provided crucial context about the threat your family faced and the inadequacy of conventional remedies. She paused, consulting notes from the other panel members. However, this panel must also consider the broader implications of military officers taking personal vengeance using official resources. The precedent such actions could set for military discipline and civilian oversight concerns us greatly. My heart sank. Despite everything I'd said, despite the justification I'd provided, it seemed the panel was going to focus on the procedural violations rather than the protective necessity. That said, Admiral Harrison continued, this panel recognizes that Admiral Davis acted from paternal instinct in an extraordinary situation where civilian authorities had proven inadequate. While his methods were irregular, his motivations were understandable, and his results eliminated a legitimate threat. She looked directly at Marcus. Admiral Davis, this panel finds that while your actions exceeded proper authority and violated several protocols, they were motivated by clear and present danger to your family rather than personal vendetta. You will face administrative sanctions and mandatory retirement, but criminal charges will not be pursued. The relief in the room was palpable. Marcus would lose his career, but he would keep his freedom and his family. As we left the federal building together, Marcus took my hand with the same gentle strength he'd shown throughout our marriage. "Thank you," he said, simply. "For what?" "For understanding that sometimes protecting the people you love requires crossing lines that other people think shouldn't be crossed." I squeezed his hand, thinking about Emma waiting for us in Phoenix, about the life we'd rebuilt together, about the man who'd sacrificed his career to ensure our daughter's safety. 2 years later, I was standing in the kitchen of our new home in Charleston, South Carolina, watching Marcus teach Emma how to tie sailing knots. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that overlooked a small marina where Marcus kept the 30-foot sailboat he'd bought with his military retirement funds. Emma, now 4 and showing no lingering effects from her injuries, was completely absorbed in mastering the bowline knot, her small fingers working carefully under Marcus's patient guidance. "Like this, Daddy?" Emma asked, holding up her somewhat crooked attempt at the knot. "Perfect, sweetheart," Marcus said, though his version of perfect had evolved considerably from his military days. Practice makes progress, not perfection. The transformation in Marcus had been remarkable to witness. The man who'd once planned operations with military precision now approached life with a relaxed confidence that seemed to suit him better than the rigid structure of Coast Guard service. He'd found work with a private maritime security company, using his expertise to protect commercial shipping without the political constraints of military bureaucracy. Our marriage had emerged from the trial stronger than before, forged by the understanding that we'd both been willing to sacrifice everything to protect our family. The moral ambiguity of what Marcus had done in Mexico had never fully resolved itself, but we'd learned to live with the complexity of loving someone who'd crossed lines most people never even see. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts, and I looked through the window to see a familiar figure on our front porch. Agent Rebecca Torres stood there, but she wasn't wearing the severe government suit I remembered from our previous encounters. Instead, she wore casual clothes and carried what appeared to be a gift bag. "Agent Torres," I said, opening the door with surprise, "what brings you to Charleston?" "Actually, it's just Rebecca now," she said with a slight smile. "I left the Inspector General's office 6 months ago. I was in the area visiting family and wanted to stop by, if that's okay." Marcus appeared beside me, instinctively protective despite the years that had passed. Emma peeked around his legs, curious about this new visitor who clearly knew her parents. "Rebecca Torres," Marcus said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "This is unexpected." "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Rebecca said. "I wanted to speak with both of you, if you have a few minutes." We settled on the back deck overlooking the marina, while Emma played with her sailing knots nearby. Rebecca watched Marcus interact with our daughter, her expression thoughtful in a way I couldn't quite interpret. "I need to tell you something," Rebecca began, "something that couldn't be said during the official proceedings." Marcus and I exchanged glances. We'd assumed that chapter of our lives was closed, that the investigation and its aftermath were behind us.
The case against your brother, Rebecca continued, wasn't as straightforward as we presented it publicly. She pulled out a folder from her bag, though this one lacked the official seals and classification stamps I remembered from before. After the tribunal concluded, I continued investigating the smuggling network that Jake had contacted. What I found changed my understanding of everything that happened in Mexico. She opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents that looked different from the official case files. The network Jake Morrison contacted wasn't just moving drugs and weapons. They were involved in human trafficking, specifically targeting children for exploitation in Central America. My blood went cold. Emma looked up from her knots, sensing the change in atmosphere, but quickly returned to her play when Marcus smiled reassuringly at her. "Rebecca Torres," Marcus said, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "This is unexpected." "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Rebecca said. "I wanted to speak with both of you, if you have a few minutes." We settled on the back deck overlooking the marina, while Emma played with her sailing knots nearby. Rebecca watched Marcus interact with our daughter, her expression thoughtful in a way I couldn't quite interpret. "I need to tell you something," Rebecca began, "something that couldn't be said during the official proceedings." Marcus and I exchanged glances. We'd assumed that chapter of our lives was closed, that the investigation and its aftermath were behind us. "The case against your brother," Rebecca continued, "wasn't as straightforward as we presented it publicly." She pulled out a folder from her bag, though this one lacked the official seals and classification stamps I remembered from before. After the tribunal concluded, I continued investigating the smuggling network that Jake had contacted. What I found changed my understanding of everything that happened in Mexico. She opened the folder, revealing photographs and documents that looked different from the official case files. The network Jake Morrison contacted wasn't just moving drugs and weapons. They were involved in human trafficking, specifically targeting children for exploitation in Central America. My blood went cold. Emma looked up from her knots, sensing the change in atmosphere, but quickly returned to her play when Marcus smiled reassuringly at her. The intelligence gathered after the raid revealed that Jake had been recruited not just as a passenger, but as a potential asset. His desperation and willingness to hurt a child had made him attractive to people who specialized in that kind of cruelty. Marcus leaned forward, his expression sharp with the tactical awareness I remembered from his military days. "Are you saying Jake was being recruited for child trafficking?" "The evidence suggests that possibility," Rebecca confirmed. "Communications intercepted from the network leadership indicated they were evaluating him for recruitment into their child exploitation operations. His attack on Emma had actually served as a kind of audition. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Jake been willing to hurt Emma once, but he'd potentially been aligning himself with people who made harming children their profession." "Why are you telling us this now?" I asked. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, watching Emma's innocent concentration on her knots. "Because I spent 2 years investigating whether Admiral Davis had abused his authority to settle a personal grievance. What I discovered was that he'd actually prevented something much worse from happening." She closed the folder and looked directly at Marcus. "The network was planning to use Jake's connection to your family as leverage for future operations. They'd identified Emma as a potential target, not just for Jake's personal vendetta, but for their broader criminal enterprise." Marcus's jaw tightened, and I saw the flash of the protective intensity that had driven him to orchestrate Operation Seahawk. "Admiral Davis," Rebecca continued, "your operation didn't just eliminate a threat to your family. It dismantled a trafficking network that had been responsible for the exploitation of dozens of children across 3 countries. She pulled out a final document, a letter on the Department of Justice letterhead. "This is unofficial, and it can never be part of any public record, but the Attorney General wanted you to know that Operation Seahawk is now considered one of the most successful anti-trafficking operations conducted in the past decade." Marcus read the letter silently, his expression cycling through surprise, vindication, and something that looked like relief. "The children you saved," Rebecca said quietly, "will never know your name or what you sacrificed to protect them. But they're alive and safe because you refused to let your brother disappear into a network that would have used him to hurt more families like yours." Emma suddenly appeared beside Marcus's chair, climbing into his lap with the unconscious trust of a child who'd never doubted her father's ability to keep her safe. "Daddy, I tied the knot," she announced, holding up a perfect bowline. "You certainly did, sweetheart," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion as he hugged her close. After Rebecca left, Marcus and I sat on the deck watching Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The revelation about Jake's potential involvement with traffickers had reframed everything we thought we understood about the threat our family had faced. "Do you think we would have figured it out?" I asked. "If Jake had stayed in Mexico, if your operation hadn't stopped him?" Marcus was quiet for a long time, holding my hand while we watched our daughter's joyful pursuit of the blinking lights. "I think Jake would have hurt more children," he said finally, "whether ours specifically or others like her. He'd proven that he was willing to cross that line. People like him don't usually stop escalating until someone stops them." Emma ran back to us, her small hands cupped around a captured firefly. "Look, Mama, I caught one." "Beautiful, baby," I said, helping her open her hands to let the firefly return to its family. Sometimes the most precious things need to be set free. As we watched the firefly rejoin its dance with the others, I thought about the complexity of the choices that had brought us to this peaceful evening. Marcus had used military resources to eliminate a personal threat, crossing legal and ethical boundaries in the process. But in doing so, he'd also prevented crimes against children we'd never met, in places we'd never see. "Marcus," I said as we prepared to head inside, "do you ever regret what you did?" He looked at Emma, now tired from her firefly chase and ready for her bedtime routine, then at the home we'd built together in the aftermath of his career's destruction. "I regret that it was necessary," he said. "I regret that Jake made the choices that led to his death. I regret that Emma had to be hurt for me to understand the full scope of the threat we faced." He paused, gathering Emma into his arms for the walk inside. "But I don't regret protecting our family, and I don't regret the children who are safe tonight because Operation Seahawk succeeded." Later, after Emma's bath and bedtime stories, Marcus and I stood in our bedroom looking out at the marina where his boat bobbed peacefully at its mooring. "What do you think will happen next?" I asked. "Next, we live the life we fought to protect," Marcus said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "We raise our daughter to be strong and kind. We remember that sometimes protecting the people you love requires making choices that other people might not understand." He turned me around to face him, his expression serious but peaceful in a way I'd rarely seen during his military career. "And we remember that family isn't just about blood relations, Mia. It's about the people who would cross any line, pay any price, and face any consequence to keep each other safe." Outside, the fireflies continued their ancient dance, creating points of light in the darkness that reminded me of hope, of beauty that persists even in difficult times, and of the simple truth that sometimes the most profound acts of love happen in shadows where most people never look. Our story had begun with violence and betrayal, had moved through justice and retribution, and had ended with understanding and peace. But more than that, it has taught us that protecting a family sometimes requires becoming someone you never thought you could be, and that the people who truly love you will stand beside you even when you cross lines that can never be uncrossed. As I fell asleep that night, listening to the gentle sounds of the marina and the steady breathing of the man who'd sacrificed everything to keep us safe, I knew that whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, our family had already proven that we could face anything together. 5 years had passed since that terrible Saturday when Jake pushed Emma down the stairs, and I was standing in the ballroom of the Charleston Harbor Resort, watching my daughter dance with her father at his retirement ceremony. Not his military retirement, that had happened years ago under very different circumstances, but his retirement from Davis Maritime Security, the company he'd built from nothing into one of the most respected private security firms on the East Coast. Emma was 9 now, tall for her age and fearless in the way that children become when they've been loved unconditionally and protected absolutely. She wore a navy blue dress that matched Marcus's business suit, and she was concentrating intensely on not stepping on his feet as they moved to the music. The ballroom was filled with an unlikely mixture of people, former Coast Guard colleagues who'd maintained their friendship despite the circumstances of Marcus's departure. clients from the maritime security business who respected his expertise and integrity, families of the crew members who worked for Davis Maritime, people who'd come to understand that Marcus Davis was someone who took the protection of others as seriously in civilian life as he had in military service. But there were also people in attendance whose presence told a different story entirely. Rebecca Torres, now working as a victim's advocate for trafficked children, had flown in from Washington. Dr. Sarah Chen, the child psychologist who'd helped Emma process her early trauma, was there with her husband. Most significantly, there were 3 adults I'd never met before, people whose presence Marcus had requested but hadn't fully explained until that morning. "Mia," Marcus had said as we prepared for the evening, "there are some people coming tonight who I want you to meet. Their stories are connected to ours in ways you'll understand when you hear them." The first was Maria Santos, a woman about my age who worked as a social worker in San Antonio. The second was David Kim, not Marcus's former defense attorney, but a different David Kim who taught elementary school in Phoenix. The third was Jennifer Walsh, a nurse from Denver who specialized in pediatric trauma recovery. After the formal ceremony concluded, and Emma had been swept away by the other children to raid the dessert table, Marcus brought these 3 people over to where I was standing. "Mia," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a story I sensed was important, "I'd like you to meet some people whose lives were changed by Operation Seahawk." Maria spoke first, her voice steady but emotional. "Mrs. Davis, your husband's actions in Mexico led to the rescue of my son. He was taken by traffickers when he was 7 years old. The network that your brother contacted was the same group that had Miguel. When that operation dismantled their organization, we got our boy back after 2 years of not knowing if he was alive or dead." My hands went to my mouth in shock. I'd known intellectually that Marcus's operation had broader consequences, but hearing from someone whose child had been directly saved made it real in a way that official reports never could. David Kim stepped forward next. "My daughter was being groomed by the same network through online contacts. The FBI was able to identify and arrest her would-be abductors using intelligence gathered during the Mexico raid. She never knew how close she came to being taken, but I know, your family's sacrifice saved mine." Jennifer Walsh's story was different but equally powerful. "I treat children who've been rescued from trafficking situations. The medical supplies and safe house funding that this network controlled was eliminated when their leadership was arrested. Dozens of children received proper medical care and psychological support because the organization could no longer operate." I looked at Marcus, seeing him in yet another new light. The man who'd risked everything to protect Emma had inadvertently become the protector of children he'd never met, in places he'd never been. "Marcus," I said quietly, "did you know? When you planned the operation, did you know about these other children?" He was quiet for a moment, watching Emma spin around the dance floor with some of the other kids, her laughter carrying across the ballroom. "I knew the network was involved in trafficking," he admitted. "But honestly, Mia, in that moment, I only cared about protecting our family. The fact that other children were saved was an unintended consequence of making sure Jake could never hurt Emma again." Rebecca Torres joined our group, carrying a folder that looked familiar but somehow different from the official documents I remembered. "Actually," she said, "there's something else you both should know, something that wasn't in any of the official reports." She opened the folder to reveal photographs, school pictures, family portraits, candid shots of kids playing and laughing.
These are the 43 children who were identified as targets or victims of the trafficking network. Every single one of them is safe now because Operation Seahawk eliminated the organization's ability to operate. The photos showed children of various ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds, but they all shared something in common. They were alive, free, and protected because Marcus had refused to let Jake disappear into Mexico without consequences. "There's more," Rebecca continued. "The intelligence gathered during the operation led to arrests in 6 other countries. The network's financial assets were frozen and redistributed to victim support organizations, and the communication intercepts revealed dozens of other criminals who were subsequently arrested." She pulled out a final document, a letter on White House letterhead. This came through classified channels, but the president wanted your family to know that Operation Seahawk is now considered a watershed moment in international anti-trafficking efforts. The ripple effects are still being felt 5 years later. Emma appeared at my side suddenly, tugging on my dress with chocolate frosting on her fingers. "Mama, Mr. Marcus says we can take the boat out tomorrow if the weather's good. Can we, please?" I looked down at my daughter, healthy, happy, completely unaware that her father's protection of her had saved dozens of other children from unimaginable horrors. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, smoothing her hair. "We'll make a whole day of it." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marcus and I found ourselves alone on the resort's balcony overlooking Charleston Harbor. The lights of the Coast Guard station twinkled in the distance, a reminder of the life he'd left behind to protect our family. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd made different choices that day?" I asked. Marcus considered the question seriously, as he did everything that mattered. "I think about Jake sometimes," he said, "about the boy I remembered from your childhood stories, before desperation and bitterness turned him into someone who could hurt a child. I wonder if there was another way to reach him, some intervention that could have saved him too." He paused, leaning against the railing as he watched the harbor traffic navigate the evening waters. "But then I think about Emma, about Maria's son Miguel, about all those other children whose names I'll never know. And I realize that some threats are so serious, so immediate, that the luxury of perfect solutions doesn't exist." Emma's voice drifted up from the lobby below, where she was saying goodbye to her new friends and promising to write letters. Her voice was strong, confident, completely free of the fear that had marked her early childhood. "The hardest part," Marcus continued, "isn't living with what I did to Jake. It's living with the knowledge that if I hadn't acted, if I'd chosen to work within normal channels and accepted the limitations of civilian law enforcement, dozens of children would have suffered or died." I took his hand, feeling the calluses from his years of maritime work, the strength that had always made me safe. "Marcus, in all these years, through everything we've been through, I've never asked you this directly. Do you think Jake would have come back for Emma?" His answer came without hesitation. Yes. The psychological profile that Rebecca's people developed made it clear that Jake's attack on Emma wasn't an isolated incident. It was the beginning of an escalation pattern. If he'd disappeared into that trafficking network, if he'd learned their methods and adopted their worldview, he would have returned eventually to finish what he'd started. The thought chilled me, but it also provided a kind of closure I hadn't realized I needed. And the other children, the ones in the photos? They would have suffered the fate that Emma was spared. Jake would have learned to hurt children professionally, systematically, without the personal motivation that at least provided some limit to his cruelty. We stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the harbor and the distant music from the ballroom below. "What happens now?" I asked the same question I'd posed years earlier, but with a completely different context. Marcus smiled, and I saw in his expression the peace that had taken years to develop. "Now we enjoy the life we fought to protect. We watch Emma grow up strong and fearless. We remember that protecting the people you love sometimes requires sacrifices that others might not understand. And we live with the knowledge that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most important victories." Emma appeared in the doorway behind us, tired from the evening's excitement, but still energetic enough to bounce on her toes. "Are you coming inside? They're going to cut the cake." "We'll be right there, sweetheart," I said. As we prepared to rejoin the celebration, Marcus paused and looked back at the harbor one final time. "Mia, I need you to know something. Everything I did, every choice I made, every line I crossed, it was all to protect our family. But if I had to do it again, knowing everything I know now about the cost and the consequences and the children who were saved," he looked at Emma, at our daughter who would grow up free from the threat that had once shadowed her childhood. "I would make exactly the same choices, every single one of them." Inside the ballroom, Emma was indeed cutting a cake, not the official ceremony cake, but a smaller one decorated with sailboats and anchors, a celebration of the new life we'd built together. As I watched her carefully distribute pieces to her new friends, I realized that our story wasn't really about revenge or justice or even protection. It was about love, the kind of love that refuses to accept that evil can triumph over innocence, the kind of love that will cross any line, pay any price, and face any consequence to ensure that the people who matter most are safe. And as Emma handed me a piece of cake with a frosting sailboat on top, I understood that sometimes the greatest acts of love happen in the shadows, performed by people who will never be recognized as heroes, but who change the world one protected child at a time. The last thing I remember from that evening was Emma falling asleep in the car on the drive home, her head resting against the window as she dreamed what every dreams come to children who've never had to fear that the people who love them won't be strong enough to keep them safe. In the end, that's what family really means. Not the people who share your blood, but the people who would sacrifice everything to ensure you never have to face the darkness alone. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.